All right, ready to dive into something kind of controversial? We're talking immigration and crime today.
Oh, yeah, gonna be good.
I bet you've already got some thoughts on this one.
Don't we all?
But hold on to those hot takes for a sec, because we're going to be looking at some excerpts from a fascinating paper.
Hit me with it.
It's called, get this, Go Wom, Ge Yi.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, and for those who don't speak Korean, that translates to immigration, crime, and the battle with data.
Ooh, a battle with data. I like it already.
Right, so get ready to have your assumptions challenged, because the data might just surprise you.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so to really unpack this, we need to bring in an expert, and that expert is criminologist Charis Kubrin.
Ah, Kubrin, yeah, she's a big name in this field.
She is, and for good reason. She spent over a decade researching how immigration really impacts crime rates, like digging into the nitty-gritty.
Getting past the headlines and the gut feelings.
Exactly, and what she found, well, let's just say it flipped the script on everything we thought we knew.
It sounds pretty juicy. What did she discover?
So get this, Kubrin found evidence suggesting that immigration might actually lead to, wait for it, lower crime rates.
Whoa, lower crime rates. That goes against a lot of the narratives we hear.
Right. It's a serious curveball.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder how she even stumbled upon that connection.
I mean, was she expecting to find that? Or was it a total accident?
Well, it all started with an article by sociologist Robert Sampson back in 2006.
Okay, I know Sampson. His work on social disorganization theory is pretty foundational.
Exactly. Well, he was studying Chicago neighborhoods, and he found something really interesting.
What's that?
Areas with a lot of recent Mexican immigrants, they actually had lower rates of violence compared to other parts of the city.
So the neighborhoods with more immigrants were actually safer.
Yeah, pretty counterintuitive.
Big time. And what was the reaction to Sampson's findings? You'd think people would be interested?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the thing. Get this. Kubrin was actually the only person who reached out to Sampson with positive feedback. Can you believe that?
Wow, so everyone else was basically telling him he was wrong, even though his data was solid.
Yep, pretty much. Talk about an uphill battle.
Yikes.
I know, right? It's like people had already made up their minds.
Yeah, like they didn't even want to consider another perspective.
Exactly. So Kubrin, she saw something in Sampson's work that others missed, something really important.
She must have. What did she do with it?
Well, she didn't just leave it at that. She saw an opportunity to, dig deeper,
Makes sense. Follow the data where it leads.
Right. So Kubrin started doing her own studies, expanding on Sampson's findings.
I can see how that would be intriguing, taking those initial findings and seeing if they held up in other contexts.
Totally. But she didn't stop there. She took it a step further.
Yeah.
And used this technique called meta-analysis.
Okay, meta-analysis. Now we're talking.
I know, right? But hold on a sec. For those of us who aren't research nerds like us, break down what meta-analysis is and why it's so important.
Sure. So think of it this way. Meta-analysis is like a study of studies. Instead of just looking at one research paper, you're taking, say, 50 different papers, all with their own findings, and combining them to get a bigger picture.
Ah, so it's like looking at the forest, not just the individual trees.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Kubrin and her colleague Graham Owsley did. They analyzed over 50 studies on immigration and crime.
Wow, that's got to be like a mountain of data.
Oh, yeah, we're talking over 550 individual findings.
So 4 years of intense analysis, all that data crunching, what did it all reveal?
The results were pretty consistent. They found a link between immigration and, you guessed it, decreased crime rates.
Okay, so even with all that data, the connection was still there. That's pretty significant, right?
It is, but there's a nuance here. The link was considered weak.
Weak? What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means that the majority of the findings showed no direct correlation. Like, immigration didn't automatically cause crime to go up or down.
Right. So it's not a simple cause and effect situation.
No, it's more complicated than that. But here's the interesting part. In the cases where there was a connection, get this, immigration was 2.5 times more likely to be linked to lower crime rates.
Wow, so even though it's a weak link, the evidence seems to lean towards immigrants actually making communities safer.
Wait, that's what the data suggests.
But here's the thing. Why doesn't this match what we hear in the news or even just casual conversations? Why is there this disconnect between, the research and what people believe?
That's a question that Kubrin grappled with, and it led her to do something pretty remarkable. She realized that just publishing her research in academic journals wasn't enough. She had to engage directly with the public.
So she went beyond the ivory tower, so to speak.
Exactly. She started giving public talks, writing articles for more mainstream outlets, even doing media interviews, anything to get people thinking differently about this issue.
That's pretty gutsy, especially considering she was already facing pushback for her findings. It kind of makes you wonder why this topic is so sensitive. You know, why are people so resistant to this idea, even when the data is right there in front of them?
Yeah, I mean, immigration is often a really politicized issue, and it can be really hard to change people's minds when their beliefs are so deeply ingrained.
It's like people cling to their beliefs, even when presented with contradictory information.
It happens all the time, unfortunately.
And for Kubrin, challenging those beliefs, well, it came at a personal cost, didn't it? We mentioned the backlash earlier, but how bad did it actually get?
Oh, it was rough. She was harassed online, received hate mail, even faced threats, for simply sharing her research findings.
Wow, that's scary. It just goes to show how difficult it can be to challenge the status quo, especially when those views are tied to something as emotionally charged as immigration.
Absolutely.
Her experience reminds me of other scientists who face similar pushback, like Pamela Ronald with genetically modified crops, or Paul Offit with vaccines. It's like, if your findings go against the grain, you're going to have a tough time.
Yeah, and that's a real problem because it can discourage scientists from pursuing important research or speaking out about their findings.
For sure. Okay, but let's get back to the data for a moment. You mentioned earlier that the link between immigration and lower crime was considered weak. So what are some of the limitations we need to keep in mind when looking at this research?
Right. So one of the big things is the data itself. Crime statistics rely heavily on police reports and victim surveys.
Yeah, and those aren't always perfect, right?
Definitely not. Things like, fear of deportation among undocumented immigrants can make them less likely to report crimes, even if they're the victim.
That makes sense. What about surveys?
Well, surveys depend on people being honest about their own behavior, and that's not always a guarantee.
Right. So how do researchers deal with these limitations? Is there any way to get a more accurate picture, even with those potential biases?
One way is to focus on the most reliably reported crime, which is homicide.
Homicide. Why homicide?
Because murders are almost always reported, making the data much more accurate and less susceptible to things like underreporting.
Makes sense. So what does the homicide data tell us about immigration and crime?
Well, interestingly enough, even when focusing on homicide rates, the trend still holds up. Areas with higher immigrant populations tend to have lower homicide rates, which further supports the overall findings.
So even with that more reliable data, the connection is still there. That's really interesting.
It is, and it adds another layer of evidence to the argument.
Okay, so we've established that there's this real data-backed connection, even if it's not perfect. But now I'm curious, why? Why might immigration lead to lower crime rates? What are some of the possible explanations?
Well, Kubrin has a few interesting hypotheses. One of them is the idea of immigrant self-selection.
Immigrant self-selection. What does that mean?
So think about the people who choose to immigrate, especially those going through legal channels. They often demonstrate incredible resilience, determination, a really strong work ethic, all qualities that might contribute to lower crime rates.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're already wired for success and stability.
Yeah, exactly. And those traits might translate to being less likely to engage in criminal activity.
That's fascinating. Are there any other factors at play?
Oh, absolutely. Another one could be the strong social structures that you find within immigrant communities.
Right, like they often have these close-knit communities, right?
Yeah, and those communities provide a sense of belonging, support, and a strong emphasis on family values, all of which can act as protective factors against crime.
So it's not just individual traits, but the community itself kind of acting as a buffer.
Precisely. And speaking of families, Kubrin also points out that immigrant families tend to have lower divorce rates, which can create a more stable environment for kids, potentially reducing their risk of getting involved in criminal activity.
Okay, so we've got individual drive, strong communities, stable families, all potentially playing a role in this phenomena. But even with all this evidence, changing deeply ingrained perceptions is still a huge challenge, right?
Oh, yeah. It's a massive undertaking.
I mean, Kubrin herself compares it to putting a Band-Aid on a dam. Doesn't seem very hopeful.
It's definitely an uphill battle, no doubt about it.
It really suggests that data alone might not be enough to overcome those deeply ingrained biases and the influence of, like, misinformation, especially in a world where information is so readily available, but context and accuracy are often missing.
It's a problem, that's for sure.
It's a really sobering thought. It makes you wonder, if data isn't enough, What can we do to shift these perceptions and have more productive conversations about immigration and crime?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. But before we tackle that, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to explore how we can bridge this gap between research and public understanding.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure, how to bridge that gap between what the research says and what people, actually believe, especially on a topic as loaded as immigration.
Right. We've been digging into these fascinating findings from Kubrin's work.
Some really thought-provoking stuff.
It is, but I'm sure some folks listening are thinking, hold up, I've heard some totally different stories about immigration and crime. So let's talk about that. Are there arguments on the other side of this debate?
Oh, absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that this whole immigration and crime thing, it's complex, there's nuance, it's not black and white.
So it's not as simple as saying immigration always equals lower crime.
Right. We can't just make these sweeping generalizations. The context matters a lot.
Context? Okay, so what are some of those contexts where immigration might actually be linked to higher crime rates?
Well, there's research that suggests that in areas that already have high crime rates, places with weaker social institutions, a sudden influx of immigrants, it can sometimes put a strain on resources and make those existing problems worse.
So if a community is already struggling, a big wave of immigration, regardless of who those immigrants are, it might kind of add fuel to the fire.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, but it's important to remember correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Exactly. Just because crime goes up in a place that's also seeing a lot of immigration doesn't mean the immigration caused the crime increase.
So how do we figure out what's really going on then? How do we untangle all these factors and figure out what's actually driving crime rates?
Well, that's where more research comes in. We need studies that go deeper than just those simple correlations.
So more digging, more nuance.
Exactly. We got to look at the underlying mechanisms, the specific conditions, the social dynamics, all that good stuff.
It sounds like there's still a lot we don't know about this whole issue.
Oh, yeah. Tons of unanswered questions.
Like what? What are some of the big questions researchers are still trying to figure out?
Well, one area that's really interesting is the long-term effects of immigration on crime. Most of the studies we've been talking about, they look at relatively short time frames.
Right, like snapshots in time.
Exactly. But what happens over multiple generations? Do those crime trends hold up or do they shift? Lots of interesting stuff to explore there.
It really shows how much we still have to learn about this whole interplay between immigration, crime, and the social fabric of communities.
For sure. Another area that's ripe for research is the impact of specific policies and programs, things aimed at integrating immigrants.
Right, like do certain approaches work better than others?
Exactly. Can we create environments that, really foster those positive traits we talked about earlier, like strong families and communities? Lots of possibilities there.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener. It's amazing how much our initial assumptions can be challenged when we really dig into the data.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to always be questioning, always be learning.
And to be open to different perspectives.
Absolutely. We need to be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to these complex social issues.
So don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Do your own research. Think critically.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to, question your own beliefs.
Right. Challenge those assumptions.
Yeah. Approach these topics with curiosity and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Well said. Okay. But going back to Kubrin's experience for a second, she faced a lot of pushback for her work. It's kind of unsettling, right? Like someone dedicating their career to understanding these issues is attacked for just sharing their findings.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
Why do you think her research specifically has been met with so much resistance?
Well, you got to remember that immigration is often tied up with other really sensitive topics like national identity, cultural change, even economic competition.
Right. So for some people, Kubrin's work might feel like a personal attack, even though it's just data and analysis.
It happens. It can be hard to separate those emotional responses from the facts.
So how do we even begin to have these conversations in a way that's productive, where people feel like they can share their concerns without being judged or dismissed?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? I think it starts with recognizing that these conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but that discomfort doesn't mean we should avoid them.
So lean into the discomfort.
In a way, yeah, we need to create spaces where people feel safe to express themselves, to engage with different viewpoints, even if they disagree.
It's about building bridges, right?
Right.
Finding common ground, even when we don't see eye to eye on everything.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all come to these conversations with our own baggage, our own experiences, our own biases.
And trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yeah, empathy is key. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Well said. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, that whole idea of immigrant self-selection.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating concept.
All right, it makes me wonder if those traits we talked about, resilience, strong work ethic, if those are more common among immigrants, is there a way to cultivate those qualities in all communities, not just immigrant ones?
Now, that's a really interesting question. If we could figure out how that self-selection process works, maybe we could find ways to foster those same traits in everyone.
It's like taking the best of what makes these communities thrive and spreading it to everyone.
Exactly. It could have huge implications for education, for community development, even for how we as a society value things like hard work and community.
It's almost like we're talking about a cultural shift, a reevaluation of what we prioritize as a society.
Yeah, and it's a big challenge, no doubt, but it's a challenge worth taking on.
It's an inspiring vision. Imagine a society where those values of hard work, resilience, community support are woven into the fabric of every neighborhood.
It's a powerful idea, that's for sure.
It is, and it's something worth striving for. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. So we've been kind of unpacking this whole idea that, certain positive traits like resilience and a strong work ethic might be more common among immigrants.
Yeah, those self-selection factors we talked about.
Right. It makes you wonder, what if we could somehow, bottle that magic and spread it to all communities, not just immigrant ones?
It's a fascinating thought, right? If those qualities are really contributing to lower crime rates in immigrant communities, imagine if we could find ways to cultivate them everywhere.
Yeah, it'd be like taking the best of what makes those communities thrive and using it as a blueprint for creating safer and more resilient societies as a whole. But how do we even start to do that?
Well, it wouldn't be easy, that's for sure. It would require a pretty fundamental shift in how we approach things like education, community development, even how we talk about success and belonging as a society.
So we're talking about a pretty huge undertaking here, like a system-wide change, not just some small tweaks or isolated programs.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture. Think about it. A lot of immigrant communities, especially those facing economic hardship or social marginalization, they often rely on these really strong social networks and family support systems to overcome adversity.
So those close-knit communities, they're not just about cultural preservation or something. They're actually serving as a safety net, helping people succeed.
Precisely. And that's something we can all learn from. What if we invested in strengthening those support systems in all communities? What if we focused on building social capital, fostering mentorship programs, creating opportunities for people to connect with and support each other, regardless of their background?
It's like weaving a stronger social fabric, where everyone feels a sense of belonging and has access to the resources and support they need to do well.
Exactly. And part of that is addressing the root causes of crime, too, right? Things like poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic inequalities, all those things play a role.
So it's not just about copying the good stuff from immigrant communities, but also tackling those bigger societal issues that contribute to crime in the first place.
Absolutely. It's about creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has a real chance to succeed.
This kind of brings us full circle to what we were talking about earlier, bridging that gap between research and public understanding.
Yeah.
How do we get people to see the value in these ideas, to understand that supporting immigrant communities isn't a zero-sum game, that it ultimately benefits everyone?
Yeah, that's the challenge. We need to move beyond those oversimplified narratives and the fear-mongering that often dominate these conversations about immigration.
Right. We need to focus on the facts, on the data.
Data is important, but it's not always enough. We need to appeal to people's hearts as well as their minds.
So stories, personal experiences, things that connect on an emotional level.
Exactly. We need to put a human face on these issues, help people see the shared values, common goals that connect us all, rather than focusing on what divides us.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity.
Absolutely. And it's about emphasizing those values of compassion, fairness, opportunity, making it clear that supporting immigrants isn't about taking away from anyone else. It's about creating a better society for everyone.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation, and it highlights just how complex these issues really are. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, but by being curious, by challenging our own assumptions, and by having those sometimes tough conversations, we can start to move in the right direction.
I agree. It's been great exploring these ideas with you today.
Likewise, and to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep learning, keep those conversations going. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a new fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.